Hi, everyone. I know it's 11:59, almost noon. So we're just going to give it a minute as folks come in. We'll get started in just a moment. So I would like to start with welcoming everybody to our Insider Speaker Series, Creating a Culture of Inclusion in Parks. Thank you all for joining us. We will get started shortly, but in the meantime, we do have two icebreaker questions here. So feel free to drop your name, pronouns, organization you might be with, where you're located, anything you like to introduce yourself in the chat. And you can answer these questions as well. We have the first question is, what are you hoping to learn today? And the second is, what does inclusion in parks mean to you? And so my name is Haley Gonzalez. I am the Community Partnership and Impact Manager here at California State Parks Foundation. I've been with the organization for actually 4 years this month. I joined February of 2020, and I'm joining from Oakland, California today. So as folks are dropping their information into the chat, we're going to go over a few logistics. So first, everyone will be muted as they join. Please use the Q&A function if you have any questions that come up during the chat. And please note that our panelists will not be answering questions in the Q&A section during the webinar. We will be answering questions at the end during the Q&A session. If we don't get to all of the questions, we will be following up in an email. And then the last thing, we'd like to ask folks to please be respectful of each other, be respectful of the speakers. We do recognize that for some folks, discussing access, inclusion, representation can be a difficult conversation, and it can be uncomfortable. So just, a reminder that we're all here to learn, hear different perspectives from our own, and really try and understand how we can all create a culture of inclusion in parks. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Efraín Chávez-Delgado, who is the Director of Grantmaking at Justice Outside. He was born and raised in Stockton, California, and grew up shifting in and out of the city and its rural agricultural outskirts. He has a BS in Environmental Science and Management from UC Davis. And prior to working with Justice Outside, he's worked as an outdoor and gardening educator, a food justice program coordinator, and a community organizer. And then we have John Frazier. He's the Capital District Superintendent for State Parks. John's a Northern California native and has lived in Sacramento since 2004. He manages 6 state parks in the Capital District, a few of those including the California State Railroad Museum, Sutter Sports State Historic Park, which we'll be hearing a little bit about shortly, the State Indian Museum, and the State Capitol Museum. So thank you both to our panelists for being here today. Before we have you all speak, we're going to learn a little bit why inclusion is important to California State Parks Foundation. So the mission of California State Parks Foundation is protecting and preserving the California State Park system for the benefit of all. And this work includes building a network of organizations and people who are creating inclusive experiences in parks, amplifying the needs and voices of marginalized communities, and advocating for policies that will provide a foundation for a park system that really reflects the needs of Californians, especially those who are most marginalized. And so we're accomplishing these things by doing the following. You'll see here under our access and experiences, we have ensuring every visitor has a sense of belonging in state parks, prioritizing positive and meaningful experiences, and then forging a lifelong connection to parks. And so what some of this work looks like is relevant programming, welcoming park staff, amenities that are inclusive and accessible, We want to make sure first-time park experiences are positive. So, signage is clear, folks know where they're going, the trails are well-maintained. And then finally is prioritizing equitable access and positive experiences, which will foster a diverse constituency that will really value and preserve state parks for future generations. And then another way we're ensuring that we are centering inclusivity at California State Parks Foundation is through our justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity work. We have JADE is the acronym we use. So we have our JADE commitments, we have a JADE plan, and these commitments in this plan are really the foundation of our access and experiences work, as well as the work we do across the organization. Every department here at California State Parks Foundation has a role when it comes to equity, inclusion, justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity. And so lastly, I will say that we recognize access and inclusion encompasses a lot. And, that's everything from race and gender, disability, socioeconomic status. And so for the purpose of this conversation, our focus is really going to be around race, ethnicity, partnering with Indigenous communities, and talking about these systems created that have led to people being excluded based on those aspects of their identity. So again, we recognize this is a very broad topic, and we here at California State Parks Foundation will keep moving this work forward with future conversations about how we can create inclusive parks. And so with that, I'm going to invite our first speaker, Efraín, to present on his work with Justice Outside.
Thanks so much, Haley. Hi, everybody. Good to be in the digital world with everybody. Yeah, my name's Efraín Chávez-Delgado. I use he, him pronouns. And I'm working with Justice Outside as a director of grantmaking for our Liberated Paths grantmaking program. And I'm excited to share a little bit of insights and learnings I have gained in this field of work. And to set us up, I really do. I first want to give a quick context to who my organization is, and to a more specific level, kind of like what Liberated Paths is. So at large, Justice Outside works to advance racial justice and equity in the outdoor and environmental movement. To do this, we shift resources to build power with and center the voices and leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because the health of current and future generations demands it. Furthermore, as part of one of our programmatic components to make this systemic change is our Liberated Paths grantmaking program, which, as you can see on the slide, supports outdoor initiatives and organizations that cultivate and celebrate the contributions of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and affirm the many experiences and identities our communities hold through grantmaking, capacity building, and network building. What really underpins a lot of this work we do is an approach that leans into something that's more relationship driven and trust based, something that's a bit counter to what traditional philanthropy has kind of unraveled to be in the Western kind of sense. And so leaning into some of the learnings regarding inclusion and creating a welcoming culture for BIPOC communities, I first want to quickly re-highlight that in our practice, we do our best to center, whenever possible, the voices and experiences of BIPOC communities. And so a lot of what I'm sharing today is drawn from insights and patterns I have seen from annual and interim grant reports that we review on an annual basis. And we actually also did a couple of, I had some one-on-one conversations prior to this session to get some up-to-date insights and reflections from folks. And what I have found over the years is that community is super critical for BIPOC folks who are looking to engage in public spaces. These are super supportive in being able to bring folks into a space that maybe is a little different and maybe has the potential for them to get othered, if you will. And the types of communities that that can benefit these experiences are pretty diverse. It can be like family communities being taken out to parks, community groups, affinity groups based on race, gender, ability, etc. Youth development programs. We can see in some of these pictures on the slide at Matlawayo State Marine Reserve. That is a indigenous. The folks you see there are participating in an indigenous youth development program, many of them revisiting ancestral lands. Bottom left, you can see a picture of the cute little critters laying on the beach, Año Nuevo State Park, which is a really frequent and common spot for a lot of our Latinx organizations who take out folks out into that community. And of course, in the top left and bottom right, you'll see folks out in community as well for engagement with the outdoors. And so again, centering community really allows us to leverage the positive impact that the pre-existing trust and rapport and comfortability brings with that. Slide, please. And on this next slide, there's some more insight on what can be supportive in creating an inclusive and welcoming experience when going out to public land and space. It's really pertinent to prepare to do some prep work that's more than just the typical water, snacks, and sunscreen. Like, don't get me wrong, that's super important. And I think what's been really pertinent and revealing in my listening to community members on the ground is that there's this another degree or another layer of emotional and spiritual preparation that needs to be made when re-engaging or revisiting outdoor spaces that have historically excluded them systemically and culturally. Many folks having othered experiences that maybe triggers negative responses. And so there's always a layer of preparation that needs to be made for that, beyond logistics, beyond kind of like the typical stuff you'll get ready for. And this is really important to be done pre, during, and after the visit as well. A lot of grantee organizations that Justice Outside supports have this explicitly planned out in their itinerary as part of their walkthrough and exposure for their community members into the outdoors. So there's that extra level of care that's integrated. And then lastly, an increasing need for there to be an acknowledgement of the ongoing legacies in relation to that public land and the communities visiting them. Definitely, there's been more of a shift in, at least here in California, for there to be more recognition of maybe the uglier side of the legacy associated with a lot of public lands and spaces. But I think what's also super key is making space for there to be positive recognition of the ongoing legacies of relationship with indigenous communities and those who are stepping up in an advocacy kind of a role for said public lands. It goes a really long way for BIPOC communities to be recognized and seen in their ongoing efforts in relation to that particular land. And some things to consider for folks to kind of like food for thought to leave with. I'm at the last 3 minutes of my presentation, so I'm going to go as fast as possible, y'all. Thanks so much, California State Parks team, for dropping some links. Those are two organizations that are examples of people we've worked with, Puentes and Coastal Defenders, and some other organizations. At this point, Liberated Paths consists of about 100+ grantees. But we've learned that it's really important to defer to BIPOC communities when it comes to collaborative spaces. When reaching out to them, do our best to set up the space for them to have as much decision-making power and in the design process of an outing to a public space. Going the extra mile can be super supportive when supporting communities that have been historically excluded through simple things like parking hookups, day of troubleshooting, pre-planning for accommodations based on language and physical needs. All of this can really support in creating a type of insulation for other experiences that may other BIPOC communities entering into spaces that maybe aren't super welcoming all the time. Kind of related to one of the last points in the previous slide, an acknowledgement and persistent intention to engage in a deeper and critical storytelling of park legacies really goes a long way when trying to make these spaces more inclusive and welcoming. And then lastly, priorities are reflected in budgets. Is something I have really heard loud and clear. So at the park level, it's really important to, when approaching BIPOC communities for collaborative opportunities, to have funds available to be able to address some of the barriers that BIPOC communities historically face, cost, transportation, food, etc. Is really key. And then also the time that people put into designing these collaborative outings. Puentes and coastal defenders specifically, and many other grantees that we work with, really have shared and expressed the importance of there being stipends or some compensation made for these people who are putting in time, oftentimes in a volunteer capacity, to create programming and collaborations with state parks, with communities that they have historically maybe struggled with getting connected with. And then lastly, yeah, trust and funding means a long way to underpin this whole kind of presentation I have. Liberated Past does its best to be a participant in this larger ecosystem that's looking to reshift resources to make inclusion and welcoming cultures more systemic. And I really encourage folks on this webinar to take that home with them in consideration. I mean, I think in my last 20 seconds, we go to my last slide in case folks want to stay in touch and learn more about either Justice Outside or more specifically Liberated Paths. Please see my contact information on the slide. The staff of the foundation did a great job and also dropped a link to our website. So thanks so much, y'all. I'm going to bow out and hand it over to John.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to really highlight, I love that you brought to attention the prep work around emotional, spiritual, and acknowledgement of ongoing legacies. I think that's really important to go beyond, like you said, just the water, snacks, and sunscreen, which of course are also important. So thank you for that. And then our next speaker is John, and he's going to be talking about California State Parks and how they're approaching this work of inclusion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Haley, and thanks so much for this amazing participation in the middle of the day on a Thursday. It's so great to see this kind of interest and commitment to such an important goal. I'm going to be talking about a pretty narrow part of how access and barriers affect the state parks experience. I'm the district superintendent for Capital District, and what's unique about Capital District is all of our park units are museums and historic sites. So we don't have any of those kind of classic open space parks. We don't have any camping. So all we do is try to interpret and understand and engage with the public about historical ideas. And so what we're going to kind of tell a story, what's been happening at Sutter's Fort State Historic Park the last 4 years in particular. Because if you can't get the core purpose of a place like Sutter's Fort right, it almost doesn't matter what else you try to do to address some of these other barriers like transportation, or economic barriers, or even some of the physical barriers of how you actually get people into certain spaces. If at a place like Sutter's Fort, we don't get the core purpose of what we're trying to accomplish at the place, right? So that's what we're going to spend some time talking about today. So I'm going to take you back to March of 2020 that probably many of you remember. It's when the pandemic hit us all in a very direct way. And this was a memo that I sent out to the staff of the Capital District when we were forced to shut down all of the museums and historic sites in the Capital District. And that's going to become meaningful as I talk a little bit about some of the planning efforts that happened, because I think the unusual circumstances of the pandemic were something that allowed us to take some steps forward and how we were looking at the interpretation at Sutter's Fort in a way that probably almost under any other conditions we wouldn't have been able to do. So this is kind of the cauldron that we were dealing with a lot of these changes in, that started when the pandemic hit us all in March of 2020. And here we are not too long after that, with the murder of George Floyd. There was civil unrest here in Sacramento. You're looking at the Stanford Mansion, which is one of the park units in California State Parks. We had a National Guard unit stationed there. We had another National Guard unit stationed in Old Sacramento State Historic Park. We had state park rangers that were tasked with some law enforcement task forces around the city. So not a usual moment in any sense of the word. And what was happening is that you saw around the country when a lot of this outcry happened after George Floyd was killed. Some of those conversations became centered on how we as a society commemorate history. And you saw very quickly in the days after the killing of George Floyd, protests around Confederate statues in the American South. In Sacramento, that attention became focused on John Sutter, who for decades has become a kind of iconic figure that for many symbolized the birth of California. So we'll switch to the next slide here. A local advocacy group, primarily led by local Native American activists, turned their attention to the John Sutter statue, which was a statue near the Sutter Medical Center, right across the street from Sutter's Fort State Historic Park. The Sutter Medical Center, in our view, did the right thing by making a decision to remove that statue, and it was, I think, impressive how quickly they responded to the moment. It was really within days of some of that local activism starting that the medical center agreed to remove that statue. And then something very interesting happened the day after that statue was removed. Is there had already been a teach-in event scheduled to take place on the grounds of Sutter's Fort to protest the statue. And instead of canceling that teach-in meeting after the statue was removed, our local Native American activists and partners decided to still hold that meeting because there was still work to be done. And a lot of that attention was then turned on state parks. And it was a remarkable conversation that we as state parks were able to have with local Native American activists, tribal elders, tribal political leadership, and this remarkable kind of parade of experiences that were shared. We heard from young people in high school. We heard from parents in their 30s and 40s. We heard from grandparents, and generation after generation sharing experiences of what it was like to have to go to Sutter's Fort when they were in 4th grade or on a field trip, and how difficult it was to come in contact with what was really a kind of a prescribed type of historical experience that they knew to be something very different from what they understood about their past and their culture. And I think we walked away from that, our team in the district, but the Department of State Parks as a whole, that we had to commit to something fundamentally different than what we had done up to that point. I think we had said a lot of good things in the past, have made some minor changes up to that point, but the core of the type of interpretation we had at Sutter's Fort was still largely in place. And I think after the events of the summer of 2020, the department quickly responded and committed to fundamentally change the way we do business at Sutter's Fort. So we knew we had some big picture things to do, as you can imagine, with the state agency, that you have to go into some of these planning documents that take a little time. But we also knew we had to make some immediate changes. And by the fall, we established some interim interpretive principles that address some of the iconic types of interpretive tools that had been in place at the site for a long, long time. And so we stopped the use of period attire at the site. We stopped the use of character-based interpretive programming. And we did an immediate kind of review of all of our public-facing interpretive information, and took down some of the most inappropriate interpretation that was at the site, including an audio tour that the public could use as part of an unguided tour experience. And this was controversial. You had generations of people in the region that had experienced a certain kind of Sutter's Fort interpretation. And even for folks who recognized that there had to be a change in terms of the historical context that was communicated through the site, there was still a lot of uncertainty about what that would mean, how that would affect how young people come and learn about 19th century history. But we thought it was really important to take an immediate step back and start to look holistically at how we told stories about the past. And so at the beginning of 2021, the first thing we did before we even put pen to paper was to sit down with local tribes and hear what tribes wanted to see in a reimagined Sutter's Fort. And it was a remarkable experience where we had, I think, initially many tribal members who would be happy to see the whole place go away. That by the end of our planning experience, most tribal members recognizing what a lost opportunity that would be, that now we finally have an opportunity to tell the whole story of what Sutter's Fort represented, of who John Sutter was, and bring new tools to the site to try to explore those historical ideas. So I'm proud to say that interpretation master plan was approved by the department last year, and we're working on amending the site's general plan this year. So, and we couldn't have done it without the support of our local tribal partners. So I want to maybe stress that when we started this effort, there was a lot of fear that this meant Sutter's Fort was getting canceled, and I think folks have realized that just the opposite has occurred, that we're finally beginning to tell the truth about what Sutter's Fort is and what it represented, and we're providing new tools for young people and visitors of all ages to come and experience the site in a very different way. I also just want to stress that we're just at the beginning of this work. We have a $2.5 million commitment to update the exhibit infrastructure at the site. So we're just getting started with the changes underway, but have begun to make some changes already. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I think so what you were just really highlighting there also ties back earlier to what we were hearing from Efraín about advocating for deeper and critical storytelling of park legacies. So yeah, it's just seeing the connections there is really important for folks to recognize and talk about. So we will do a Q&A session in just a moment, but first we're going to learn a little bit about what California State Parks Foundation is doing to also help create a culture of inclusion in parks. So first I have here, we have 3 examples. In 2021, these 3 pilot programs were created as part of Governor Newsom's Outdoors for All initiative. California State Parks Foundation advocated around these through our Pathways to Parks initiative. And these programs are addressing the cost of entry to state parks. And, you know, while this is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to folks being able to access parks, these programs have been proven to be very successful solutions when it comes to eliminating the barrier of cost. And then because they're pilot programs, and because unfortunately California's budget does not look great for this next year, some of these programs are at risk of losing funding, which we'll talk about shortly. But first, I wanted to give a few highlights about these passes. So the first is the Adventure Pass, and that has recently been expanded from 19 state parks to 54 state parks. And then the Library Pass. So State Parks has conducted a survey of folks who have used this Library Pass. And some really great statistics that they've found through the survey is that 63% of people who took the survey indicated that the cost of the day use fees was the reason that they were not visiting state parks. 63.5% indicated that they were Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. And then 90% said that they will visit again 7 or more times a year because of these passes. And then finally, with the Golden Bear Pass, more than 63,000 families have received this pass, and that's compared to an annual average of just 2,500 before this program began. And then our next example is TestPlot. TestPlot is an organization that we've worked with, and their purpose is to really celebrate the labor that's involved in land care, build a strong collective land care ethic, and really create a knowledge sharing network. So their approach is culturally focused and really fosters a positive engagement with nature. And these photos that we have here are photos from their Plants, People, and Potluck celebration at Rio de Los Angeles State Park, which is in Southern California. And I chose these because I think it's a really good example of the work that TestPlot does. And so they really think of land care as more than just conservation focused. They're building ecological resilience through land-based care practices and civil engagement. And, through that, they're creating this democratic way of caring for the land because they're connecting folks, and everyone that's there has a say in what the land care looks like, what they're going to be doing with their test plots. And so I think that in a time when, funding for park maintenance isn't necessarily a priority, organizations like TestPlot are really important in helping us imagine what park stewardship can look like. And then also thinking about what park stewardship can look like outside the dominant culture that conservation and environmentalism was founded on, as we know that those can be quite exclusive. And so I specifically want to highlight this bottom photo of these women who are, I believe they call themselves the abuelas of Rio de Los Angeles. And, when you think of typical conservation, people in conservation and, in the environmental field, you're not thinking of a group of grandmas coming to, work and volunteer their time at a park. And so I think that's really cool that they're changing the narrative of what conservation can look like. And then on to our last example, we have disabled hikers. So we have supported the work with disabled hikers in creating a Northern California hiking guide. And this hiking guide does include multiple state parks. Disabled Hikers, for those not familiar, it's a disability-led nonprofit, and they're building disability community and disability justice in the outdoors. And so I had the opportunity to go on a few hikes with Siren Nagakiri. They are the founder of Disabled Hikers, as well as the author of these guidebooks. And I really got to learn from them, why they're creating these books. And what Disabled Hikers is doing is questioning that dominant narrative of who gets to experience the outdoors and what a valid outdoor experience looks like. And I think, as all of us should know, outdoor experiences look different for everybody. And so by creating these guidebooks, Disabled Hikers, like I said, is changing that narrative, as well as providing a level of detail that you don't that you don't typically often find in guidebooks. And they have a trail rating system that goes into much more detail for folks with disabilities that you don't find in the typical guidebooks. So, you know, by supporting disabled hikers, we get to hear a perspective that we don't hear from enough, as well as create not just, you know, physical accessibility out in parks, but a cultural accessibility as well. So yes, so these are just a few examples of the work we're doing around creating a culture of inclusion. We, of course, look forward to continuing to work with state parks and our partners and continuing to think about, talk about, and make parks more inclusive. So we are going to move on to our Q&A session. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the Q&A box. And yeah, so we'll get started with a few that we have here. Let's see. Okay, so this question for Efraín, could you say more about more than water, snacks, and sunscreen? Are some examples of what you've seen done well around emotional support, pre-visit prep, acknowledging legacies? I'm sorry, are there some examples is what they're asking. So are there some examples that you can give us around that preparation?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the question, Tamara. I'd say for the pre-prep, something that I've seen work really well is utilizing the typical circle up where people are setting themselves up to warm up their bodies with stretches and stuff, is interweaving activities to calm the nervous system. I think there's like a lot of literature and studies out there calling the benefits to breathing exercises, more recently somatic practices being interwoven into spaces before entering something that might be triggering has been super supportive and helpful. You can type in that keyword on the internet and you'll likely get a decent amount of examples of what you can interweave into in-person sessions. During, something I've heard that can be super supportive is training chaperones and guides to not only be really well versed in the legacies and histories of the particular piece of land, but really attentive to reading interpersonal dynamics. Sometimes it can be like, especially if it's like a really busy park, it can be tough to kind of keep an eye on. And so having a decent ratio of guides who are attentive to any maybe negative interactions they may have can be super supportive, and then kind of swooping in and doing gentle check-ins with individuals who maybe did have like a maybe unpleasant interaction or bump in with somebody or something can be super supportive. And then for debriefs, kind of like the aftercare is having explicit time to really talk about it. I think I've participated in group hikes where maybe the debrief is like, what's something really neat you saw in the park, something really positive. And I think just making space for maybe the uncomfortable othering experiences can be really validating for individuals. Sometimes that can be swept under the rug, but it can be pretty validating if you're able to share that amongst your group to get support from that from the group you're out with. But those are some of the examples coming to mind.
Yeah, thank you. I like those examples. I think I know, like, as a kid going to outings in schools, it's like everyone just knows what to do, but you don't know what to do. So it's really good to again think beyond just the typical packing and preparation. So thank you for that. Our next question for John: is state parks planning to update the history being told at other parks? So do you know of any examples similar to Sutter's Fort of state parks doing this work?
Yeah, in 2020, this became a department-wide initiative to do work very similar to what's happening at Sutter's Fort. So there is funding in place for new interpretation master plans at several state historic parks. I know Fort Ross is in the early stages of developing one. So stay tuned. I know this is something Director Quintero is very interested in seeing progress on, and is a key initiative the Secretary of Natural Resources as well, Wade Crowfoot.
Yeah, and if folks are interested, there's also the Reexamining Our Past. There's a whole webpage about the work State Parks is doing there. I know in the last recent years, like Sumag Park used to be Patrick's Point, that was renamed. So that's another example. And yeah, State Parks has some good resources on their webpage there. So we have this question, maybe both of you might be able to answer. But how can I make my school / public transportation tours more inclusive and relevant to diverse audiences?
Efraín, did you want to start with that one?
Would you mind, John? I think I'm going to
Sure.
think about that a little bit.
Yeah, no problem. I think part of the way we're thinking about that on the state park side is just having more ready-made resources for teachers and educators, so they don't have to, have all the heavy lifting on that. So I think that has been a deficiency on our side, is we haven't really been able to provide enough tools to teachers and educators. So they're bringing, their field trips into a situation with more context that can be addressed in the classroom or in some other kind of preparation way. So that is something we're spending a lot of time on. I know in just the K through 12 education world, everybody's thinking about how this affects curriculum as well. So I think there's just going to be more organic change in this area in the classroom for everyone involved.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm gonna answer from the funder's perspective. So it may not be asking or answering the question exactly how the person posing the question is hoping, but that's what's coming to mind. In the funding world, there can sometimes be really big challenges regarding what is an allowable expense, and sometimes transportation or things of that nature maybe don't qualify, and so encouraging state entities and especially private foundations to start giving in general operating is something that's been super supportive, so they can actually be utilized for what's needed on the ground, and so covering the cost of transportation so it's more accessible. General operating funds can go a long way.
Yeah, and that actually touches on a question someone asked: how can we improve the transportation barrier to parks? And that also, is a really good answer to that question. I know that there's transportation grants. I know that here at California State Parks Foundation, we will allow a percentage of the grant to go to transportation. And yeah, like I said, there's specific grants for transportation that are offered. But yeah, I think allowing it, like you were saying, Efrain, is a really good example. Let's see. So what can we do personally to help all families and individuals feel welcome and enriched by our state parks? I think that's a hard question because it depends on the person, but John, I'll open that up to you and see what examples you have, what thoughts you have.
Yeah, it's a great question that really applies to any meaningful change. I think is, there's like a structural kind of government policy funding level answer to how we make change, but then arguably the much more important part of how we make those kinds of changes happens because people like all of you go out and actually make it happen on a personal level. And the fact that you're already participating in something like this is probably a good indication that you're already doing that and maybe not realizing it. That for some reason through your own life experience, you've probably had really meaningful experiences in a state parks context or in an outdoors context, and being able to share that on your own terms, but also trying to understand, as Efrain described very well, of trying to understand on someone else's terms that maybe you haven't had those kinds of experiences, and trying to share those in a way that's that has the potential for them to understand it on their own terms. I think is the trick of it all. It really is.
Yeah, Efrain, do you have anything to add to that?
Just a small extension to what John said, I'd say is the day-to-day like interpersonal kind of opportunities you have at parks can make experiences more positive and add to individuals wanting to re-engage. And I think what ultimately is going to make the most change towards an inclusive and welcoming environment is your participation in systemic change. So to whatever capacity you're able to, plugging into organizing initiatives, pressing state parks to do systemic change is going to go a really long way.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that I'll add, in addition to what Efrain was saying, like California State Parks Foundation is an advocacy organization. So you can follow us for our advocacy work. And definitely feel free to reach out if there's anything that folks are interested in hearing from us on that piece. But also, to what John was saying, you're here, you're listening to these conversations, you're hearing different perspectives, and I think that's also a really good start. Let's see. What inclusive accommodations are available or being developed for people with various disabilities, including mobility challenges? And I will say, I think some of this goes along with park maintenance. There's been a few grants that we've granted to with our state parks improvement grant round in the past around maintenance work. I believe specifically down in Malibu, we helped fund the visitor center, and they were able to, there's some ADA features. It's more navigational now with the flooring. There's some water stations at, I'm blanking on the park, but it's a park near Santa Cruz. So I will say part of this, I believe, is probably a maintenance thing and having the money and funding for that. But yeah, open up to either of you if you're able to answer this question about what inclusive accommodations are available or might be becoming available.
Yeah, on the physical kind of architectural accessibility barriers, there was a really important federal class action case in 2005 against state parks by a group seeking more accessible accommodations in state park units. And the resolution to that case was a full-throated commitment by the department to address this. And going back to 2005, there's been a systematic effort to prioritize the highest priority locations to make these types of changes. And we actually have a comprehensive list that we can share. And we can make sure Haley gets that list. It's fairly current. It shows all the work that's happened in this space from 2005 to 2023. And it's been substantial. I mean, it's been a substantial project commitment, funding commitment, and continues to be a regular appropriation where state parks tries to address this real deficiency.
Yeah, thank you. We can include that in a follow-up email, some of that information. I have a question for you, Efrain. So the question is there any support for inner city youth that have little or zero access to green space? Access is a big issue in my community. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts or resources you could share?
Yeah, it's unfortunately a pretty chronic issue across the state and country, I'd say. And so what I would recommend is looking for organizations that are BIPOC led and have programming specifically built to combat that. A good place to start, and I'm sorry, I won't be able to speak to the specific geography this person is asking for, but if you go on the Justice Outside website or any other intermediary grant makers who focus on BIPOC led initiatives, you'll find some good places to start in terms of organizations, initiatives that are already doing some of this work. The Liberated Paths program has a fairly decent representation of organizations in the state of California. We're likely somewhere between 30 and 40 organizations spread out in the Bay Area. And this upcoming year, we're also going to be doing some work building up our California Coast Grantmaking, which, as a plug, y'all, if you go to Liberated Paths, We're going to have an open application in March 11th for funds to both support marine and ocean conservation, but also equitable access to the coast. And so it's looking for those smaller initiatives that kind of from the ground up are building their programming to combat some of those barriers.
Great. Yeah, thank you. You all have a lot of great resources on your website. So I'm sure people can find some good information there. Okay, let's see. We probably have time for one more question. Let's see. So in lower income and BIPOC communities, what's a good way to encourage youth development and stewardship in our parks and green spaces?
Well, I could take a stab. I think the nature of my job every day, I think about what we as state parks staff can do, and a big part of what we're doing is trying to get a lot of these tools that Haley talked about, Library Pass, Adventure Path. A lot of our own programming is already free anyway, so just making sure these kinds of programs are available and understood. The transportation barrier is still real, so we're also still looking at different ways. Some state parks districts have partnered through a contract agreement with county offices of education to make sure that the payment for transportation is also identified as well. So I tend to think first about kind of the structural barriers that we on the state park side can control, but I know there's the whole other side of that then is what are they actually coming to, and a lot of the issues Efraín has already discussed is, are they going to be coming into a place that they feel welcome, that they feel understood, that they see the historical experience being communicated to them as one that is relevant to their lived experience today. And so, connecting all of those dots together in terms of really providing something that's relevant and true and meaningful.
Yeah, thank you. Would you like to add anything, Efraín?
No, I think actually John did a wonderful job, and a lot of the other answers we've kind of spoken to, I think speaks to that question. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you both for your time. We really appreciate it. I hope folks learned a lot. Excuse me. And so we're going to move on to our last slide with some information for you all. We're going to be putting up a poll for topics you'd be interested in hearing about for our next webinar. And the topic is going to be how climate change is altering park experiences. So you have some choices here of what you would like to learn about. And while you're taking a few seconds and voting on your choices here, going back to the California State Park Library Pass program, we are currently advocating that the governor restore funding for this program into the budget. As a reminder, this is a pilot program, and so the funding will end December 31st, 2024, if we don't push for funding for this year. This program is extremely popular. It's the #1 checked out item of the library of those libraries that do offer it, which is over 11,000, which is over 1,100 libraries in the state of California. And so we'll be providing the link for our petition in the chat. Please head over and sign that. And we'll be following up with an email with more information as well. So yeah, thank you again for joining us, John and Efraín. We really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining us for the webinar, and we look forward to seeing you for future discussions. Bye.